Texture blurring in cycles is a feature that's been sought out for a very long time. But did you know you can do it yourself right now using nodes? Let's check it out. Welcome one and all to the very first episode of a new weekly series we're going to be uploading here on the CG Cookie Blender YouTube channel. Some of you might know me, my name is Grant, and I'm the host of a YouTube channel called Remington Graphics where I also teach Blender things, but I'm going to be here at CG Cookie for a little bit doing this weekly segment for them. We're going to be taking the time to look at a few awesome Blender tips and tricks as well as some features of Blender that you might not know about. So without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at how we can blur textures using nodes in cycles. So basically what I have set up here is a Susan head, obviously the wonderful monkey from Blender, with some basic HDR lighting applied. And what we're going to do is apply a texture checker texture to it, and we're going to go ahead and blur that. And you can do this with any texture, but in this case I'm just using a checker texture because it's built in and easy to access. So in order to do that, I'm first going to go ahead and split this window, and we're going to get the node editor pulled up on the left side here. If you guys don't know how to split windows, there are these three little lines down here. If you click on them and drag them to either the side or up and down, it'll split your window, which is a nice feature. And I switched it to the node editor. I'm going to add a material for Susan, Suzanne, close enough. And I'm going to add a texture node, and we're going to add a checker texture node and hook that up here. We're going to hook up the color output just so we get a nice white and gray texture on her head, which is perfect, which is what we're looking for. Now, in this case, again, this can be any texture you'd like. I'm just using a checker texture. I cannot say that. So the first thing we're going to do here is add a vector curves node. And the vector curves node allows us to tweak the magnitude of a vector based upon a curve. So if you have used the RGB curves editor in post-processing, this is kind of like that, except it works with vectors, which is great. So we'll hook that up to the vector input of our checker texture. And then we'll go ahead and add another texture node here. We're going to add a noise texture node. And you have to add a noise texture node here because this is what's going to actually be doing the blurring. So I'm going to hook up the color output of the noise texture node into the factor input of our vector curves node. And I'm going to change the scale up to a arbitrarily high number. So in this case, I'm just going to choose 10,000 because 10,000 is a nice big number. That's all we need. If you leave it too low, you won't get an actual blur. It'll look more just distorted. And I'll explain more about that later. Oh, and of course, siren. Next up, I'm going to add a input node and a texture coordinate node from the input category and hook up whatever output you use. In this case, I'm just going to use generated textures because that's all I really need for a checker texture like this. So up at the top of our vector curves node here, you notice we have an X, a Y, and a Z category. And when we tweak the curves for each of these categories, this is what allows us to actually change the blur. So if I drag this top node from the Z category down, you'll notice that now our texture becomes blurred on the Z axis. And if I change it to something less, it becomes a little bit more obvious. You can see that there is a blurring going on here, but there is none going on the, I guess this is the X axis right here. So if I wanted to add blurring on the X-axis, I'd come to the X section and I'd drop this down a little bit. So there we go. Now you can see we have it blurred on the X and the Z channel. So let's go ahead and blur it on the Y as well. And now we have a blurred texture. Now, the reason we have this noise texture and the reason it has to be a very high number is because it's actually not blurring the texture. What it's doing is it's distorting it in a very small fashion. So there are a bunch of tiny little details that are getting misplaced and put in different locations and thrown everywhere. So if we zoom in really close, you'll be able to actually see this. It's kind of hard to see. It helps if we change the noise texture size down to like 100, for example. You can see that this is what happens if we have a low texture texture size for the noise texture. We kind of get this strange shaping, and this is more or less what's happening on the bigger scale. It's just a lot smaller. So if we change this up to 1,000, you can begin to see that it's smaller details, right? And from afar, it looks blurred, right? But as we get closer, we can see that it's actually not. But if we change it up to something like 10,000 or 100,000 or a million or, I mean, any number that's really big, we can get these really precise blurring textures. And if we render it, it looks great. The height of this single point here is, which is the Y value, is how blurred it is, right? So right now I have a Y value of 0.62, which as it approaches 1, it becomes less blurred, and as it approaches 0, it becomes more blurred, as you can see here. So if we have a very low Y value, we'll have a very blurry, almost gradient-like image, but if we have a very high value, we'll have a very sharp image that has very little blur, as you can see going on right here. So additionally, I just dropped an image texture in here to show you that it works on image textures as well. This is just a simple brick texture I got from pixabay.com. I have a bunch of free images for use. And basically, you can see if I tweak these, we can actually blur the image. So in this case, I am blurring across the x-axis, and you can see it is becoming blurred across the x-axis. I want to do one from the z-axis though, because that would probably look best with this texture. And this is just using generated textures in this case. But you can see the texture does indeed become blurred, and it's just a really useful tool, especially if you're trying to do something that you're working with textures that are pre-made and you don't want to have to change things too much. This could be a really useful little feature that you can sneak in there. So there you have it. This is how you can procedurally blur any texture in Cycles. Anyway, that's about it for this episode, so I'll see you guys next time. This video is free, but if you're looking to master the art of Blender, head over to cgcookie.com for a paid membership that gives you access to regular live streams, guided Blender learning, and an amazing community. This chair doesn't spin very well.